Good evening, everyone. We'd like to get started. I'd like to welcome you tonight to New Canaan Library. I'm Susan LaPerla, the Director of Programming, and it really is a pleasure to stand up here and welcome you in partnership with HTG Investment Advisors. They've been wonderful supporters of the library, and what a treat to have them support this program for all of us tonight. So it's great. So thank you to HTG. So I don't usually ask this because I assumed people know, but we had a program last night and there were a lot of phones ringing during the program. So please, if you would take just a moment to silence your phone. I'm sure John will appreciate that when he's speaking to us in a few minutes. So welcome, and I'd like to introduce Valerie Connolly from HTG, and she has a few words to say to you as well, and she will introduce George Baker as John Adams tonight.
Good evening. I also, on behalf of HTG Investment Advisors, would like to welcome you to this evening's program. Abigail Adams, the first modern American woman. For those who do not know us, HTG Investment Advisors is a registered investment advisory firm right here in New Canaan, offering personalized financial planning services and investment management. I am joined by several of my colleagues tonight and would ask them to stand so that you can recognize them as well. We have Tom and Jean Ganussi, our founders. Robin Sherwood, a principal. Jennifer Nicasio. And Allison Donaldson, who's been helping everybody get settled at the back there. And I also would like to thank the New Canaan Library for co-sponsoring this special program, which is in celebration of Women's History Month. While we will listen to a story told with humor and affection shortly, we hope that this story illustrates the importance of acquiring financial knowledge and how it can empower a person, male or female. For those in relationships where one spouse or partner manages the household finances, it is a good idea for both people to be educated on the basics of personal finance. Part of our mission at HTG is to help educate people in the community on financial matters, and we invite you to contact us if you have questions. So without further ado, our special guest speaker this evening was born in Braintree, Massachusetts. He practiced law in Boston until he was selected to represent Massachusetts at the Continental Congress. He was an ambassador to France, Holland, and England, and served as vice president in the administration of George Washington. Please welcome the second president of the United States, John Adams.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Valerie. You know, when I told Abigail that I was coming to New Canaan tonight to speak to you all, she said, "Now you're going to get a wonderful reception, but don't get any ideas, John, about running for public office again, because 2 presidential campaigns are quite enough for one man and his spouse." Now tonight I want to speak about my wife, Abigail Adams, America's first modern woman, and how with me we helped found the United States of America. Abigail was born in 1744 in the town of Weymouth, in the colony of Massachusetts, which was part of Great Britain. And that meant that we were all loyal to the King of England. And in any setting like this, we would start it off with singing, "God Save the King." So pretend it's 1760. You're loyal subjects, and you will sing the song. But you don't have to sing it, just listen to me. Don't want to get you indicted for anything. God save our gracious King. Long live our noble King. God save our King. Make him victorious, happy and glorious, to reign over us. God save the King. You know, sometimes I feel guilty about fomenting a revolution and losing that great song. Wouldn't you like to hear that once in a while at Yankee Stadium? Now, Abigail was the daughter of the congregational minister, the Reverend William Smith, whom I described in a letter to a friend as a crafty and designing man. He did not like me, and I did not like him. How many of you have fathers-in-law like that? Abigail's mother, however, was lovely. And she was a Quincy, and she was from the richest and most established and oldest family south of Boston. The town of Quincy, Massachusetts is named after them, as is my first son, John Quincy Adams. And I first met Abigail when she was 15 and I was 24. Now, don't get any ideas. I would visit her at her home. I would visit her home because I was dating her older sister. But Abigail immediately appealed to me because of her wit, an energetic mind, and an unconventional and irreverent attitude. Saucy is the way I described her to a friend of mine, and saucy she has always been. Now, her mother and father were both aghast that their daughter and ultimately Abigail was dating me, because in either event, their daughters would be marrying down. You see, my father was just a farmer in Braintree, Massachusetts. My grandfather's grandfather came over from England in the 1620s, and we were all farmers. And yet, and myself, I was a lawyer, which was a profession considered several tiers below that of a minister, even then. So my future father-in-law really felt that I did not deserve his daughter's hand, even though we both graduated from the same local community college called Harvard. And when Abigail asked for permission to marry me when she was 18, her father said no. And that was the year that most young women in Massachusetts got married. Finally, after a lot of coaxing, he acknowledged that, all right, I can't do anything. And she and I were married when she was just 3 weeks shy of the age of 20, and I was 29. Now, notice the difference in our years. But how extraordinary is that? How many people who are married here have married where the woman is much younger, or at least younger, 5 years or something like that, than the man? Show of hands. A lot of you. And on the opposite, and I won't ask how many married where the man is younger than the woman? Oh, not many, not many. Well, I think Abigail's case was probably quite typical because, you know, women want to marry somebody who's more sophisticated and knowledgeable than they are, and the men their own age they regard as completely clueless. So they marry an older man, and once they're married for about 5 years, they discover that the older man that they married is also clueless. But then it's too late to do anything about that, isn't it? Now, a great test of our marriage occurred in March of 1770, 5 years into our marriage, when an event occurred in Boston called the Boston Massacre, where a group of soldiers were surrounded by a mob. The mob was taunting them, throwing things, doing all sorts of things, threatening to overrun them, to kill them. And the soldiers fired, and 6 colonists lay dead on the street. And the soldiers were arrested for murder, and the next day I was asked to defend them as defense counsel. And I discussed this with Abigail because I knew this would have a major impact on my career and finances and all sorts of things, because I told Abigail, you know, if I take on these soldiers as clients, I will become the most hated man in Boston, even by my own clients. And she said, you mean your former clients? Well, ultimately, I was able to get them all off. So not only did I have these terrible clients, but I got these clients freed. And I thought I was going to have to move to New York or Philadelphia to continue the practice of law. But I later found out that the people respected me for taking on this unpopular case, which actually sort of sets a precedent in many cases where you don't blame the attorney just because his client is so obnoxious or horrible, because everybody deserves to have an adequate defense. Now, didn't hurt to have as a cousin during that trial in difficult times, Sam Adams, who was head of the Sons of Liberty and made it clear to everyone that if I was tarred and feathered, they'd have to hear from him. Now, some of you are familiar with Sam Adams, at least the brew, if not the man. And I'm often asked, well, did you like Sam Adams? Did you like his lager or his ale? And I always say, you know, my favorite drink was a full tankard of hard cider at breakfast. And Abigail would always say, John, oh. And I'd say, Abigail, it's good for the digestion, as well as the disposition, if you know what I mean. And that's how I would do those things. Now, the next great test for our marriage came in 1774, when I was asked to represent Massachusetts at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. I was one of 5 delegates chosen, and this was a Congress of all the colonies, so that instead of having the British deal with us one at a time, we would all deal as 13 colonies. But this meant I would have to leave my law practice in Boston, leave Abigail and the farm, leave our then 3 children. And it would also mean the loss of my income. And Massachusetts wasn't paying my compensation. They would pay a little bit of my expenses. Now, by rights, Abigail should have said, no, you don't do that. Get somebody else to do that. We're not that wealthy. What are you thinking of, John? But she said, no, I will do that because I am doing that for what will become a nation that I know you will form. What a courageous woman she was. And you know, that separation, going to Philadelphia, was just the start of many, many separations. First in Philadelphia, and then in Paris, and then in Holland, and then in London, that mounted over 10 years at different intervals, 10 years when we were separated. And she put up with that. And she used to say to her friends that My husband is so ambitious, he is always first in line to be hanged. Took a lot of nerve to be my wife. And by this time in 1775, particularly at the outbreak of hostilities at Lexington and Concord in April of that year, more and more people were singing a different song than God Save the King. Remember God Save the King? Well, for most people, the king was probably the last person we would have wanted God to save. And they were singing a new song, and it was called Yankee Doodle. Yankee Doodle was written by a British Army doctor, and it was to make fun of the American soldier. Doodle meant a fool. Yankee meant someone from New England. This is how it went. And yet, what happened was it became our national anthem of a sort. Soldiers would march to it, people would sing to it, and it was always in the air. Yankee Doodle went to town, a-riding on a pony, stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. Yankee Doodle, keep it up, Yankee Doodle dandy, mind the music and the steps, and with the girls be handy. You know, I've always thought that we should play Yankee Doodle at Yankee Stadium. Now, wouldn't that make sense? Anyway, our separation with me in Philadelphia and Abigail in Braintree made necessary a constant stream of correspondence back and forth. People have accumulated our correspondence and found that they number over 1,100 letters. 1,100 letters. And one of the ways in which they're so complete and the collections are so complete stems from the fact of how people wrote letters in those days. First, you would write the first draft, write it out, and then you would write the final copy. And you would send the final copy and you would keep the first draft. So you would remember what you had sent. And perhaps the most momentous letter from Abigail, and I have to say, when you read the letters between Abigail and me, there is no question that Abigail is a fantastic writer. And I want to read one of the most momentous letters, was dated March 31st, 1776, in which she instructed me to remember the ladies. A passage which has transformed Abigail into a feminist icon. She wrote, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors were. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands as your ancestors did. Put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity." She continued, "Your sex are naturally tyrannical, and all men would be tyrants if they could. Men of sense of all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex." And this is the killer sentence. Such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. How about Abigail for president? Now, Abigail, and I knew right away, was speaking about the relationship between a husband and a wife. A relationship that she felt was so unfair because of a common law rule called coverture. And the idea was that when a man and a woman were married, Only one person survived that, and that was the man. And he got all of his wife's property, even things she inherited or would inherit, all of her real estate, for instance. He couldn't sell it, but without her permission, but if she gave permission, he could sell it and keep the proceeds. A married woman could not own any real estate, could have no cash, no bank accounts, no personal property. Married women never had wills, right? Because to have a will, you have to have some money to leave to somebody. They had no money to leave to anyone. And I see there are women right here looking very upset about that, right? Well, just think how Abigail felt. And that's what Abigail was talking about. And Abigail defied this whole thing. She had her own money. And she had an uncle called Cotton Tufts who held it for her and managed it for her. You know, she didn't have the ability of having the HTG investment advisors. If they existed then, she certainly would have gone to them. But she had her Uncle Cotton Tufts, and she called the money that I call my own. And I knew she was accumulating this money, and I knew that there was no way I could control what this saucy girl was doing, particularly since I was in Philadelphia, and then I was in France, and then I was in Holland, and then I was in England, while she was home managing all of our estate. How could I tell her, don't put the money in your own name? And in retrospect, thank God I was away, because it gave Abigail the ability to really make some money for the Adams family. She invested in securities. At that time, the whole area was full of what we would call junk bonds. Bonds and currencies that were issued by the states, who had no possibility of ever paying them back. Bonds that were issued by the federal government that didn't seem to have any ability to pay it back. And so you could get a bond or a security at pennies on the dollar. And Abigail, and I must say that it might seem strange, but dealt in insider trading. Because she knew that when the Constitution was ratified, one of the agreements that Alexander Hamilton set with the states, Alexander Hamilton was going to be the first Treasury Secretary, he said, we will take all of your obligations, take them all in, and we will pay for them. You know, so bonds that were issued by Massachusetts that no one expected to be paid would be paid by the federal government, but Massachusetts has to stop issuing their own currencies, their own bonds, having their own banks. We're going to federalize finances. And Abigail knew this was going to happen with the ratification of the Constitution. So here she was ending up getting all these things, buying bonds that were, for 8 cents on the dollar. They would pay a full dollar plus 6% interest all the way back from when they were issued. So we did very, very well. I also want to tell you about just practical things. You know, there I was an ambassador to France, and I was actually, because I was being hired by the Continental Congress, I actually got a salary. So there I am in Paris, and I'm getting a salary. Well, what do I do with the money? Well, I worked out there was a bank in Paris that had some sort of arrangement with a bank in Boston, and so I used that, and I got my salary put into our account in the bank in Boston. I felt so clever, you know. And I wrote to Abigail, and I told her what I was doing. She wrote back, quite disturbed. She said, John, don't send me cash. There's a war on. There's nothing to buy in Boston with the cash you're sending me. But where are you? You are in Paris. Paris. You can buy anything in Paris. What I want you to do is buy something that's decorative, like women's material for women's dresses, curtains, things that are kind of splendid. Buy them wholesale, not retail. Send them by diplomatic post to me in Boston, and I will be able to sell them like that. So there I was with instructions from Abigail. And I went out and I was looking around. There was a big haberdasher's store. And you know how in Paris they have things out on the streets, you know. And there I saw the most beautiful thing. And it was whether it was a handkerchief or a scarf or whatever, it was just absolutely beautiful. And the proprietor said, "Oh, you like that, sir?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he says, "Well, that's a Barcelona handkerchief. We just got a full shipment of them. And how many do you need, 20? And I said, "Well, how many do you have?" He said, "Well, I don't know." So we went there. He had 3 boxes of Barcelona handkerchiefs. I bought them all. Wholesale. Shipped them by diplomatic post. Abigail got them, sold them all in 2 weeks in Boston, and raised enough money that she was able to buy us a brand new carriage, which we desperately needed. And, you know, especially for Abigail, a carriage was so important because she was the daughter of the congregational minister, and the daughter of the congregational minister doesn't ride on a horse. And she would ride on a horse. She liked riding, horseback riding, but only on our farm where she wouldn't be observed. When she would go to town, she would have to ride in a carriage, and we had a carriage that was a disgrace. So now she had a beautiful carriage. Abigail was also a land speculator. At that time, they were trying to raise money for a treasury for a new state that was being formed, and it was Vermont. And so they said that everybody, per person, could purchase 1,630 acres. And it was for a particular price. And they were doing this, so Abigail got 5 shares for 4 children and for me. Now remember, she couldn't buy this because she was a woman, and women weren't allowed to own any real property. But she bought over 8,000 acres. So she writes to me and she says, "John, I just bought 8,000 acres of Vermont property." And I write back to her and I said, "But Abigail, I don't like Vermont. I don't want to live in Vermont." She ultimately sold it for a profit. But if you go to Bennington, Vermont, there's a bookstore there, and there's a big banner in the back of the bookstore, and it says, "I don't like Vermont. I don't want to live in Vermont, John Adams." Well, that's what that's all about. Has nothing to do with my real liking of Vermont. You know, in 1816, 2 years before Abigail died, Abigail made out a will, leaving $5,000, the modern equivalent of about $200,000, in 25 bequests to friends and relatives. 23 of those 25 bequests were to women. Most of them were married women. And this was her way of saying to her friends, "Look, this is your money. It's not your husband's money. You keep it. Do what you want with it. It's mine. I'm giving it to you. You use it in the same way." And this was her defiance of coverture. You know, in the 1840s, long after our deaths, Abigail in 1818 and mine in 1826, all of the states repealed their rules on coverture. I want to tell you about a major test of affection that Abigail had for me. And was when I went to France as an ambassador to the Continental Congress in 1778. Now, she knew that I would be a faithful husband, even though I would be in Paris. But when I arrived in France, I did the stupidest thing I think anybody could ever do. I wrote to Abigail and I described how beautiful and intelligent all of the ladies were. Now, there's a certain kind of rule that you have as a husband that when you're with your wife, you do not notice any other women, and secondly, you certainly don't talk about them. And this is what I wrote. To tell you the truth, I admire the ladies here. They are handsome and very well educated. Their accomplishments are exceedingly brilliant, and their knowledge of letters and arts exceeds that of the English ladies much, I believe. Now, Abigail took a long, long time to respond to that letter. And I wondered what the reason was, and so, of course, I took out the first draft, and I read it, and I said, oh, my goodness, I'm in trouble. She wrote, Dear John, in this country, meaning the United States of America, you need not be told how much female education is neglected or how fashionable it has been to ridicule female learning. And the next year, when I was home for 4 months before going back to France, I wrote the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which as of today is the oldest existing state constitution. And in it, I tried to make up for my comments about the intelligence of French women that so offended Abigail's by mandating in the Massachusetts Constitution that state and local governments provide universal public education for both male and female children. Abigail would have made a very good president of the United States, but she never would have subjected herself to the nasty presidential campaigns that have marked all of American politics right from the beginning. And those of you who think that character assassination, slash and burn tactics are recent creations should study the election of 1800 when I ran unsuccessfully against Thomas Jefferson for re-election. And Thomas Jefferson was the eventual winner. Abigail could not stand any of these terrible politics. And she used to say, when you hurt him, I am the one who bleeds. And presidential politics has always been an American blood sport, especially hard on the candidates' families. And I'll give you an example. One of the critics in that campaign of 1800, when I ran for re-election as president, stated that John Adams is mentally deranged, subject to uncontrollable emotional fits, and at times absolutely mad. And this critic was Alexander Hamilton. You've heard that name. First Treasury Secretary and a member of my own Federalist Party. 4 years after he wrote this, Alexander Hamilton was killed in a duel by Vice President Aaron Burr, whom I understand was not the last vice president to shoot somebody. So you think politics is rough now. Here the vice president kills the former Treasury Secretary. Well, there was a huge funeral for Hamilton in New York City, and when I was asked if I attended it, I said, no, but I approved of it. My political enemies even tried to create a sex scandal about me. Now, isn't that ridiculous? Valerie, I said, ridiculous, not impossible. They said that when I was an ambassador to London, my fellow ambassador, Charles Pinckney, had hired 2 mistresses, 2 for him and 2 for me. And when I was asked about that, I said, well, anyone who would think that I would have a mistress, let alone two mistresses, had never met Abigail Adams. Oh, that's what I hope she said. Now, I have to confess, and being in the library, it's quite appropriate. Another love that I have other than Abigail, and that is with books. When my father gave me a book when I was 6 years old, I was so excited about it, and I wrote about this in my autobiography. I lost all interest in sports and girls. Probably something a politician would never write today, right? But there it was, and I just found books to be wonderful. When I was President of the United States, I established the Library of Congress with an appropriation of $5,000 to purchase 600 books and 13 maps from a London bookseller. I myself had accumulated a library of over 3,000 books, private library. The only person that had a larger private library of over 7,000 books was Thomas Jefferson. That's right. When my son John Quincy Adams was looking at college, he went to New Haven and looked at Yale, and I said, what do you think about it? And he said, you know, Dad, their library is only half the size of yours. So he went to Harvard, and I hope I haven't offended any Yale alumni in the audience, whom I want to assure you, I'm sure your library is much bigger now. Now, the big thing about books was this was the only way we had experts on this side of the Atlantic. All the experts were in Europe, and they wrote their expertise in books. The universities that we had here would teach you, basically the classics and things like that, but they weren't research universities like the Sorbonne or Oxford or Cambridge. And I want to tell you a story about how one young man used those books. His name was Henry Knox, and in 1775, he had bookstore had been running for about 3 years. He was only 24 years old. And he was an enthusiastic 24-year-old and a very large, obese 24-year-old. And he ran a bookstore he called the London Bookshop. And he was fascinated with one subject. And he bought on this one subject every book that was published in the English language. And he ordered them all from London, and they were on artillery science. Artillery science. He loved artillery science. He was this big kid, he's 24 years old. And I would go into his bookshop and I'd buy a few books from him just to support him. And he was just a wonderful, wonderful young kid. Well, anyways, 1775, the British occupied Boston. He closes down his bookshop, and he takes his books on artillery science, which numbered 11, and he goes and he joins the Continental Army that's gathered outside of Boston, about 12,000 troops, ultimately under the leadership of George Washington. And they were trying to get out of Boston 10,000 British soldiers. And it was a stalemate. It was a stalemate. The British had enough troops to resist American aggression, but not enough to conquer us. And it went back and forth. And you remember there were some horrific battles, like the Battle of Bunker Hill or Breed's Hill, where there was 1,000 casualties on either side. So here was Henry Knox, this young man, and he was in this, they put him in an artillery unit, and one of the problems with the artillery unit, it hardly had any artillery. There were hardly any cannons that he could use. And so the stalemate went from spring to summer to fall, now the beginning of winter. And Henry Knox couldn't stand it any longer, and he went to the headquarters of General Washington, and he knocked on the door, and he said, I have to speak to the general because I have an idea of how to throw the British out of Boston. And I said, well, young man, Henry Knox, aren't you work on some fortifications? Yes, I've worked on fortifications. But you have an idea. Well, I'm sorry, but the general's too busy to see you today. Comes 2 days later, same thing. I have an idea how to throw the British out of Boston. And again, finally on the fourth day, actually, George Washington is in his headquarters. This is the headquarters on Brattle Avenue, which is now the Longfellow House in Cambridge. Henry Knox knocks on the door, and again, they say, wait a second. Man goes in, and here's George Washington with his staff. They said, there's this young man, Henry Knox. He's been here now, this is his fourth time, and he says he has an idea of how to throw the British out of Boston, and he insists on speaking to you, General. So General Washington said to his staff, well, none of you have had any idea of how to throw the British out of Boston. Let's hear from this young man. And so this young man comes in, and again, he's big, he's almost morbidly obese. He has very rough-looking features and manner. And so Washington says, so young man, what is your idea? General, we captured 4 months ago Fort Ticonderoga, the southern end of Lake Champlain. In Fort Ticonderoga are 72 cannons. Each of those cannons are bigger than any cannons that we have, bigger than any cannons the British have. And if we can move those 72 cannons and put them on Dorchester Heights, pointing down at the British encampment and at their ships in the harbor, the British will leave like that. Well, the staff, they looked at him and they said, well, that's more than 300 miles, and it's now in the Berkshires, it's full of snow and ice. If this were in the summertime, you might be able to have an idea about this, but this is way too, we're in winter. And Knox says, that's exactly the time, the best time to move heavy cannons in winter, because you build sleds, you put those cannons on the sleds, and you slide them with oxen across, and you can get much faster using these sleds. So they said, well, have you ever moved sleds? Get cannons on sleds, Mr. Knox? And he said, no, I haven't. And what was your civilian occupation? Bookseller. Well, how do you know this will work? And he says, well, I've read all the books on artillery science, and that's what they advise. So Washington said, young man, do you have any of these books with you? And he had brought 2 of them. Show me one of them, and where it talks about moving sleds in the winter, cannons and sleds. Washington takes the book, closes the book, and says, give this young man whatever he needs. And on March 5th, 1776, the British awoke in Boston, and they looked up, and there were on Dorchester Heights 72 cannons pointing down at them. And the British immediately tried to elevate their cannons, but it was too much of an angle. And the British ultimately asked for a truce. And the British general, General Howe, said, if you will give us 2 weeks, we will get out of Boston with our troops and our navy. But if you fire on us, we'll make sure that Boston is burnt to the ground. Now here's George Washington. He's gotten these 72 cannons, and he sort of wants to know what they're going to do, right? But he also is a politician, and he knows he shouldn't do something that will destroy the city he was trying to protect. So he said, all right, you have 12 days. And on March 17th, 1776, the entire British Army and Navy sailed out of Boston and went to Halifax, Nova Scotia. They went with 2,000 Tories, people who were good friends of mine, my co-counsel in the Boston Massacre trial, for instance, and the lawyer in Worcester who taught me how all the law so I could become a member of the Massachusetts Bar. This day of March 17th is still celebrated in Boston as Evacuation Day. Now, some of you who might have been in Boston, last week, and you'd see all the celebration, thinks it was for St. Patrick, right? But it was for anybody, it was for Henry Knox. Henry Knox. And what happened to Henry Knox? When Henry Knox brought those cannons to Dorchester Heights, George Washington was there waiting for him. And this was somebody who wasn't even in the army, wasn't a private, wasn't an officer, wasn't anything. He had a certificate signed by the Continental Congress making Henry Knox a colonel. 6 months later, Henry Knox became a general. And 12 years after that, Henry Knox entered George Washington's cabinet as Secretary of War. Pretty good for a fellow who reads. And who liberated Boston without a shot, but with a book. Now, the revolution that we fought in 1776, and the nation that we formed then, would go on to have many more American revolutions in each generation when ordinary citizens like ourselves would join together, not in self-interest, but in self-sacrifice, to help America in its challenges and its perils and make the United States of America a better country. And I want to tell you a final story, and this is the story of George Washington. It's 1777, and George Washington is about to lose his entire army, and it won't be to the British. It's December 1777. He will lose them because at the end of the month, the enlistments of practically all of his 12,000 soldiers are up. So he has to figure out some way of getting them to re-up, or else they can go home and they won't be AWOL and they won't be deserters. They just can go home. So he called for an evening assembly, and there were the 12,000 troops in the field, and George Washington on his horse. He told them that he had just gotten the Continental Congress to issue them a special 1-month bonus. If they would re-up for a year, they would get this 1-month bonus at the end of June 1778. 1-month bonus. And the salary for a soldier at that time, 1 month, was $10 a month. And that was equivalent to about $2,000 in today's money. So Washington said, if you will re-up, you will each get a $10 bonus at the end of June. Now now Washington said, everyone who will re-up, please step forward. And no one stepped forward. And it was said that the look of shock on Washington's face was apparent to everyone around him. And Washington turned his horse and galloped about 100 yards and stopped. And he stopped for about 2 minutes. And then he turned his horse and he rode back to his troops. And he said these words, if you will come with me, in the next 6 months, you and I can do more in that period of time than you could if you went home and you lived another 50 years. Because in the next 6 months, you and I can protect and defend this nation, the United States of America, whose liberty will be a blessing for all your future generations. Now who will serve with me, Washington asked. And everyone stepped forward. And it was, each of those soldiers knew that Washington was no longer talking about $10, was he? He was talking about their souls. And what kind of legacy or spiritual inheritance would they be leaving to their sons and their daughters? Now, I'd like to sing a song that was written by Eugene Shear, and it was first sung by Norah Jones in Ken Burns' documentary on the Second World War in 2008. It's called America, I Gave My Best to You. And it talks about America's tradition of self-sacrifice that's been handed down from generation to generation. It was sung again by an Air Force sergeant at the dedication of the 9/11 memorial at the Pentagon in 2008. All we've been given by those who came before, the dream of a nation where freedom would endure, the work and prayers of centuries have brought us to this day. What shall be our legacy? What shall our children say? Let them say of me, I was one who believed in sharing the blessings I received. Let me know in my heart when my days are through. America, America, I gave my best to you. America, America, I gave my best to you. Thank you. Thank you. You know, after Abigail died in 1818, I looked for and found Abigail's will, the one that she left 25 bequests in. And I, as her surviving husband, could have ignored her will, just crumpled it up and thrown it away, and kept all the money myself, which under the laws of Massachusetts was mine, not hers. And no one would have objected that the will of a married woman was not probated. Instead, I made sure that all of Abigail's 25 bequests were fully paid, knowing that that is what my saucy girl had trusted me to do. And to conclude, I'd like to say that one of the themes about America is that we took the best that the British gave us and we improved it. Even their songs. You remember that first song that I sang? God Save the King. Well, we changed the words to that, so now it's one of our most beloved anthems, and you all learned how to sing it in kindergarten. My Country 'Tis of Thee, and I'd like you to finish by joining me in singing the first verse of My Country 'Tis of Thee, and when you sing it, feel that you're hearing the lyrics for the first time. My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my father died, land of thy pilgrim's pride, from every mountain side let freedom ring. Thank you very much. It's been a wonderful audience, and may God bless you and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.